They called it the Jug, short for Juggernaut. At 7 tons fully loaded, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was the heaviest single-engine fighter ever built when it roared into combat in 1943. But weight wasn't what made Luftwaffe pilots break formation and dive for cover. It was the sound, 8 synchronized 50-caliber machine guns, all firing at once, unleashing 6,400 rounds per minute of devastating firepower. Behind this aerial apocalypse stood one man's genius, John Moses Browning, a gunsmith from Utah who had died 12 years before the first P-47 ever flew. His M2 Browning machine gun, perfected in the 1920s, would become the most lethal air-to-air weapon of World War II. But here's the shocking truth that military historians rarely discuss. The P-47 wasn't supposed to carry 8 guns. The original design called for 6. The decision to add 2 more, made almost as an afterthought during a rushed design meeting in 1940, would alter the entire trajectory of the air war over Europe, turning what should have been a modest fighter into a flying fortress that could shred enemy aircraft at 800 yards and return home with half its wings shot away. Spring 1940, Farmingdale, Long Island, Republic Aviation Corporation. The conference room at Republic Aviation smelled of cigarette smoke and desperation. Alexander Kartveli, the brilliant Georgian engineer who had fled the Russian Revolution, stood before a blackboard covered in calculations that would determine whether his company survived the war. Outside, the world was collapsing. France would fall in weeks. Britain stood alone, and the United States Army Air Corps had just issued the most demanding fighter specification in aviation history, Specification R-40C. The requirement seemed impossible. The new fighter had to reach 400 miles per hour, faster than anything currently flying. It needed to operate at 40,000 feet, where the air was so thin that pilots blacked out and engines choked. Most critically, it had to carry enough firepower to destroy heavily armored German bombers in a single pass. The Luftwaffe's new Focke-Wulf FW-190 was already terrorizing RAF pilots over the Channel, and intelligence reports suggested the Germans were developing bombers with armor plating that could shrug off the 30-caliber rounds that American fighters still carried. Kartveli's initial design, designated the AP-10, called for 6 50-caliber machine guns, the standard armament for American fighters. 6 guns firing the M2 Browning's 750-grain bullet at 2,900 feet per second would deliver approximately 4,800 rounds per minute. On paper, it seemed adequate. But adequate wasn't going to win the war that was coming. Major Alexander de Seversky, Republic's founder and a decorated Russian ace from World War I, had different ideas. De Seversky had witnessed firsthand the carnage of aerial combat, where pilots often had only 2 or 3 seconds to fire before their target escaped. He understood something that the engineering calculations couldn't capture. In combat, more guns didn't just mean more bullets. They meant more chances to hit, more psychological impact, and more structural damage concentrated in those critical seconds of firing opportunity. 6 guns make you competitive, de Seversky argued, his Russian accent still thick despite 2 decades in America. 8 guns make you dominant, the difference between wounding a bomber and destroying it completely. Nerdy! The debate raged for 3 days. Adding 2 more guns meant redesigning the wing structure to accommodate the additional weight. Each M2 Browning weighed 64 pounds, and with ammunition, mounting hardware and feed systems, each gun installation added nearly 200 pounds. The wings would need reinforcement, which meant more weight, which meant a larger engine, which meant more fuel, which created a cascading series of engineering challenges. But Kartveli saw something in the numbers that changed his mind. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine they planned to use produced an unprecedented 2,000 horsepower, more than enough to compensate for the additional weight. And the P-47's unusual design, with the turbocharger mounted in the rear fuselage, created a massive airframe that could absorb the extra armament without compromising performance. On May 6, 1940, Kartveli made the decision that would define the P-47's legacy. 8 guns, 4 in each wing, positioned to converge their fire at 300 yards, close enough to guarantee devastating accuracy, far enough to keep the P-47 outside the effective range of bomber defensive guns. But the decision to mount 8 guns was meaningless without the right weapon. And that weapon had been waiting for this moment since 1921, when a quiet Mormon gunsmith from Ogden, Utah, had solved a problem that had stumped military engineers for a generation. Ogden, Utah, 1918. John Moses Browning didn't look like a revolutionary. At 63 years old, with his wire-rimmed glasses and modest demeanor, he resembled a small-town shopkeeper more than the man who had designed more successful firearms than any other inventor in history. But by 1918, Browning had already created the model 1911 pistol, the Browning automatic rifle, and dozens of other weapons that would define 20th century warfare. The U.S. Army had approached him with a seemingly simple request: design a heavy machine gun that could penetrate the armor of the new German tanks appearing on the Western Front. The existing 30-caliber machine guns were useless against armored vehicles. The Army needed something bigger, a 50-caliber weapon that could fire a bullet weighing more than an ounce at velocities exceeding 2,800 feet per second. The challenge wasn't just creating a bigger gun. It was creating a bigger gun that could fire reliably at 600, 800 rounds per minute, withstand the enormous pressures generated by the 50-caliber cartridge, and remain light enough for a single soldier to carry the components. Previous attempts at heavy machine guns had resulted in weapons that weighed over 100 pounds and jammed constantly. Browning's solution was elegant in its simplicity, but revolutionary in its execution. He designed a short recoil-operated system where the barrel and bolt recoiled together for a short distance before unlocking. This distributed the enormous firing forces across the entire mechanism, reducing stress on individual components. The bolt locked into the barrel extension using a vertically sliding block, a system so reliable that it would function in temperatures ranging from Arctic cold to desert heat, in mud, sand, and salt water. By 1921, Browning had perfected the M2, 50-caliber machine gun. The weapon weighed 84 pounds in its infantry configuration, but when adapted for aircraft use, stripped of its heavy barrel jacket and cooling systems, it could be reduced to just 64 pounds while maintaining its devastating firepower. The M2's performance specifications were extraordinary. It fired a 750-grain armor-piercing incendiary round at 2,900 feet per second, delivering 13,350 foot-pounds of muzzle energy, more than 3 times the power of the E. 30-caliber rounds used in earlier fighters. At 500 yards, the M2 could penetrate 0.9 inches of armor plate. At 200 yards, it could punch through the engine block of a truck. But the M2's true genius lay in its versatility. The same basic design could fire armor-piercing rounds to destroy tanks, incendiary rounds to ignite fuel tanks, tracer rounds to help pilots aim, and even explosive rounds that detonated on impact. A typical P-47 combat load mixed all 4 types, creating a devastating cocktail that could adapt to any target. Browning died in 1926, never seeing his creation mounted in an aircraft. But his son Val Browning continued his father's work, adapting the M2 for aviation use. The aircraft version featured a lighter barrel, a higher rate of fire, 750-850 rounds per minute, and a solenoid firing mechanism that allowed pilots to trigger all guns simultaneously with a single button on the control stick. By 1940, when Kartveli made his decision to arm the P-47 with 8 guns, the M2 had been in service for nearly 2 decades. It had proven itself reliable, accurate, and devastatingly effective. But no one had ever mounted 8 of them in a single aircraft. The engineering challenge: installing 8 M2 Brownings in the P-47's wings created problems that pushed 1940s engineering to its limits. Each gun required a feed system capable of delivering ammunition reliably during violent combat maneuvers that subjected the aircraft to forces exceeding 8 Gs. The ammunition, 400 rounds per gun in the outboard positions, 425 rounds in the inboard positions, had to be stored in the wings without compromising structural integrity. Republic's engineers designed an ingenious solution. The ammunition was stored in metal boxes positioned behind the guns, with flexible feed chutes that could accommodate the wings flexing during flight. The guns themselves were mounted on reinforced ribs, with the barrels protruding through blast tubes that protected the wing's leading edge from muzzle blast and hot gases. The convergence pattern, the point where all 8 guns' fire intersected, was set at 300 yards during factory installation, but ground crews could adjust it based on pilot preference. Some aces preferred convergence at 250 yards for maximum destructive power. Others chose 400 yards to extend their effective range. The adjustment process was painstaking, requiring precise measurements and test firing, but it gave P-47 pilots a critical advantage. Their aircraft's firepower could be customized to their individual fighting style. The electrical firing system was equally sophisticated. A single button on the control stick activated 8 solenoids simultaneously, ensuring that all guns fired within milliseconds of each other. This synchronization was critical. If the guns fired sequentially, the recoil would cause the aircraft to yaw, throwing off the pilot's aim. Synchronized firing distributed the recoil evenly across both wings, allowing pilots to hold their aim steady even while unleashing 100 pounds of lead per second. By December 1940, the first XP-47B prototype was taking shape in Republic's Farmingdale factory. The massive fighter dwarfed everything around it. With its 8-gun armament, the P-47 would carry more firepower than a World War I destroyer, but the real test would come when pilots took it into combat against the Luftwaffe's finest, and discovered whether Browning's 20-year-old design and Kartvel's audacious decision would prove decisive in the skies over Europe. RAF Debden, Essex, England, April 8, 1943. The ground crews called them flying milk bottles because of their bulbous fuselages, but there was nothing comical about the P-47 Thunderbolts lined up on the rain-soaked tarmac at RAF Debden. The 4th Fighter Group, former Eagle Squadron pilots who had traded their beloved Spitfires for these massive American fighters, approached their new mounts with barely concealed skepticism. Captain Don Blakesley, a veteran of 2 years' combat over Europe, walked around his assigned P-47C with the critical eye of a man whose life would depend on this machine. At 12,500 pounds fully loaded, the Thunderbolt weighed nearly twice as much as the Spitfire Mach 4 he'd been flying. The cockpit sat so far back that forward visibility was terrible, and the rate of climb, the critical factor in intercepting German bombers, was mediocre at best, below 20,000 feet. But then, Blakesley noticed the wings. 8 gun ports, 4 per side, each covered with a protective patch that would blow away when the guns fired. He'd seen the technical specifications: 3,400 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition, enough for approximately 30 seconds of continuous fire. In his Spitfire, with its 8 303 machine guns, he'd often emptied his ammunition without bringing down a German bomber. The P-47's firepower was in a different category entirely. "Gentlemen," Blakesley addressed his pilots that evening in the briefing room, "this airplane may not climb like a Spitfire or turn like a Spitfire, but when you get behind a jerry and press that trigger, you're going to see something you've never seen before. You're going to see pieces of aircraft coming off in chunks." He had no idea how prophetic those words would prove. The first missions. April-May 1943. The 4th Fighter Group's first operational mission in P-47s came on April 8, 1943, a fighter sweep over the French coast designed to familiarize pilots with their new mounts and draw up Luftwaffe fighters. The mission was uneventful, but it revealed the P-47's first critical problem: range. With internal fuel only, the P-47C could barely reach the French coast before having to turn back. The massive R-2800 engine consumed fuel at a prodigious rate, over 100 gallons per hour at combat power. This meant that the P-47s could provide escort for bombers only during the first and last few minutes of their missions over France, precisely when the bombers needed protection least. The Luftwaffe had learned to wait. German fighter controllers tracked the American formations on radar, noting when the P-47s turned back toward England. Then they struck, sending up swarms of Bf-109s and FW-190s to savage the unescorted bombers over the target. Throughout April and May 1943, bomber losses mounted steadily. On some missions, the 8th Air Force lost more than 10% of its attacking force, an unsustainable rate that threatened to halt the strategic bombing campaign entirely. The P-47 pilots, forced to turn back while watching their bomber charges continue into danger, grew increasingly frustrated. The aircraft's other limitations became painfully apparent. The cockpit heater was inadequate for operations at 30,000 feet, where temperatures dropped to -50 degrees Fahrenheit. Pilots returned from missions with frostbitten hands and feet. The oxygen system was unreliable, causing several pilots to pass out at altitude. And the radio equipment, designed for shorter-range operations, often failed to maintain contact with ground controllers or other aircraft. But the most serious problem was tactical. The P-47 couldn't dogfight with German fighters using traditional tactics. It was too heavy to turn with a Bf-109, too slow to accelerate with an FW-190 at low altitude. Pilots who tried to fight the P-47 like a Spitfire died quickly. May 4th, 1943, the revelation. Everything changed on May 4th, 1943, during a mission that would redefine how the P-47 was employed in combat. Captain Hub Zemke, commanding officer of the 56th Fighter Group, led his squadron on a bomber escort mission to Antwerp. As usual, fuel limitations forced the P-47s to turn back before reaching the target. But on the return flight, Zemke spotted a formation of 12 FW-190s at 18,000 feet, climbing to intercept a group of returning B-17s. Zemke's P-47s had a 10,000-foot altitude advantage. Instead of diving immediately to engage, Zemke made a calculated decision. He would use the P-47's weight, its greatest liability in turning combat, as a weapon. He rolled his fighter into a near-vertical dive, accelerating past 500 miles per hour, faster than any FW-190 could match. The German pilots never saw them coming. Zemke opened fire at 400 yards, his 8 M2 Brownings converging their fire on the lead FW-190. The effect was catastrophic. The German fighter literally disintegrated, its wings separating from the fuselage in a shower of aluminum fragments. Zemke's wingman destroyed a second FW-190 in the same pass. The remaining German fighters scattered in panic, diving away from the American attack. Zemke didn't pursue. Instead, he used the P-47's superior dive speed to extend away from the Germans, then climbed back to altitude using the energy retained from his dive. The FW-190s, having lost their altitude advantage and unable to catch the climbing P-47s, broke off the engagement. In that single combat, Zemke had discovered the P-47's true fighting style: boom and zoom. Use altitude advantage to dive on the enemy at tremendous speed, fire a devastating burst from the 850 calibers, then use the speed from the dive to climb back to altitude before the enemy could respond. Never turn with the enemy. Never slow down. Use the P-47's strengths, its dive speed, its ability to absorb damage, and its overwhelming firepower, while avoiding prolonged maneuvering combat, where its weight became a liability. The Browning's battlefield performance. As more P-47 pilots adopted boom and zoom tactics, the true effectiveness of Browning's M2 became apparent. Combat camera footage and pilot debriefings revealed that the 8-gun armament was producing effects far beyond what 6 guns could achieve. A typical firing pass lasted between 2 and 4 seconds, the maximum time a pilot could hold his aim on a maneuvering target. In those 4 seconds, 8 M2 Brownings fired approximately 400 rounds total, delivering nearly 50 pounds of projectiles onto the target. But the destructive effect wasn't simply additive, it was multiplicative. The M2's standard combat load mixed 4 types of ammunition: armor-piercing incendiary API, which could penetrate engine blocks and fuel tanks, ball rounds for general destruction, tracer rounds that allowed pilots to walk their fire onto the target, and armor-piercing incendiary tracer APIT rounds that combined both functions. This mixture meant that every burst from a P-47 included rounds specifically designed to penetrate armor, ignite fuel, and provide visual feedback to the pilot. German aircraft, even heavily armored types like the FW-190, couldn't withstand this onslaught. The API rounds punched through armor plating, engine blocks, and structural members. The incendiary component ignited fuel, hydraulic fluid, and ammunition. A 4-second burst from a P-47 typically resulted in catastrophic structural failure of the target aircraft, wings separating, fuselages breaking apart, or immediate fires that consumed the aircraft in seconds. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabreski, who would become the top P-47 ace in Europe with 28 victories, described the effect. When you hit a German fighter with all 8 guns, it was like hitting it with a sledgehammer. Pieces would fly off immediately. Often the pilot didn't have time to bail out because the aircraft came apart so fast. It wasn't like the movies where you see tracers going back and forth. When a P-47 hit you, you were done. The mechanical challenges. But the M2's devastating effectiveness came with significant operational challenges that ground crews struggled to overcome throughout 1943. The guns were temperamental in the extreme cold of high-altitude operations. At 30,000 feet, where temperatures dropped below -50 degrees Fahrenheit, lubricants thickened, causing guns to jam or fire sluggishly. Armament crews experimented with different lubricants, eventually settling on a special cold-weather oil that remained fluid at extreme temperatures. But even with proper lubrication, the guns required meticulous maintenance. Each gun had to be removed from the wing, disassembled, cleaned and inspected after every mission. The barrels wore out after approximately 10,000 rounds and had to be replaced, a time-consuming process that required removing the wing panels and carefully aligning the new barrel. Ammunition feed problems plagued the P-47 throughout 1943. The flexible feed chutes that carried ammunition from the storage boxes to the guns sometimes kinked during violent maneuvers, causing jams. The ammunition boxes themselves, subjected to extreme G-forces during combat, occasionally broke loose from their mountings, jamming the feed mechanism. Republic's engineers worked continuously to solve these problems. They redesigned the ammunition boxes with stronger mounting brackets. They developed stiffer feed chutes that resisted kinking. They added heating elements to the gun bays to prevent lubricants from freezing. By late 1943, the reliability rate had improved dramatically, but gun jams remained a constant concern for pilots entering combat. June 26, 1943, Villers-Coublay. The mission to Villers-Coublay airfield near Paris on June 26, 1943, demonstrated both the P-47's potential and its continuing limitations. The 56th Fighter Group, now equipped with external fuel tanks that extended their range, escorted B-17s deep into France for the first time. As the bombers approached the target, approximately 40 German fighters rose to intercept, a mix of Bf-109Gs and FW-190A-4s, the Luftwaffe's most capable fighters. Hub Zemke, leading the escort, positioned his P-47s at 28,000 feet, 5,000 feet above the German fighters. When the Germans committed to their attack on the bombers, Zemke's squadron dove through them at over 450 miles per hour. The first pass destroyed 4 German fighters without loss. The Germans, expecting the P-47s to engage in turning combat, were completely unprepared for the hit-and-run tactics. But the mission also revealed the P-47's vulnerability. in prolonged combat. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, separated from his formation, found himself alone against multiple FW-190s. Unable to outmaneuver his attackers, Johnson's P-47 absorbed over 200 cannon and machine gun hits. The right wing was shredded, the fuselage was riddled with holes, and the cockpit canopy was shattered. But the massive fighter kept flying, and Johnson managed to escape by diving to ground level and outrunning his pursuers in a straight line, the only maneuver where the P-47 held an advantage. Johnson's survival became legendary, demonstrating the P-47's incredible structural strength, but it also highlighted a critical reality. The P-47 couldn't afford to get into extended dogfights. Its survival depended on maintaining energy, altitude, and the initiative, using its 8-gun armament to destroy enemies in a single pass, then escaping before they could respond. By summer 1943, P-47 pilots had developed a tactical doctrine that played to their aircraft's strengths. They flew high, typically 28,000 to 32,000 feet, where the P-47's turbocharged engine gave it a performance advantage over German fighters. They maintained formation discipline, never allowing themselves to be drawn into individual dogfights, and they used their firepower decisively, taking only high-percentage shots where all 8 guns could be brought to bear. The results were beginning to show. In June 1943, P-47 units claimed 67 German aircraft destroyed for the loss of 26 P-47s, a favorable ratio but not yet decisive. The Luftwaffe was adapting, developing tactics to counter the P-47's boom and zoom attacks. The real test would come in the months ahead, when the air war over Europe would intensify to levels no one had imagined possible. Luftwaffe Fighter Command Headquarters, Berlin, July 15, 1943. General Major Adolf Galland, General of Fighters for the Luftwaffe, studied the intelligence reports spread across his desk with growing concern. At 31 years old, Galland was already a legend, a 94 victory ace who had commanded fighter units since the Battle of Britain. He understood aerial combat as well as any man alive, but the reports from his squadron commanders over France and Germany described something that contradicted everything he knew about air warfare. The American P-47 Thunderbolt, according to Luftwaffe doctrine, should have been easy prey. It was heavy, it turned poorly, and it lacked the acceleration of German fighters at low altitude. Luftwaffe tactical manuals, refined through 3 years of combat against the RAF, emphasized turning combat and energy management. German pilots were trained to force enemy fighters into turning engagements where superior maneuverability would prove decisive. But the Americans weren't fighting that way, and German pilots were dying because of it. Galland read the after-action report from Hauptmann Johannes Naumann, commander of the The JG-26, one of the Luftwaffe's elite fighter groups. On July 12th, Naumann's Staffel had intercepted a formation of P-47s escorting bombers near Abbeville. The engagement should have been straightforward. The FW-190s had a slight altitude advantage and outnumbered the Americans nearly 2-1. The American fighters did not engage in the expected manner, Naumann wrote. When we maneuvered to force turning combat, they refused the engagement, diving away at tremendous speed. We pursued, but could not close the distance. The P-47s then climbed away from us, regaining altitude before we could intercept. When they did attack, they came from high altitude at speeds exceeding 700 kilometers per hour, fired a brief burst, and were gone before we could respond. In this manner, they destroyed 4 of our aircraft without entering a single turning engagement. Our tactical advantage in maneuverability was completely negated. This was the 3rd such report Galland had received in as many weeks. The pattern was consistent, P-47s refusing to dogfight, using speed and altitude to dictate the terms of engagement, and employing their heavy armament to destroy German fighters in single passes. The doctrinal disconnect. The Luftwaffe's tactical doctrine, developed during the Spanish Civil War and refined through the campaigns in Poland, France, and Britain, was built on several fundamental principles. German fighters were designed for maneuverability and rate of climb. The Bf-109 could outturn almost any Allied fighter. The FW-190 could outroll anything in the sky. Luftwaffe pilots were trained to use these advantages to force close range, turning engagements where superior handling would prove decisive. This doctrine had worked brilliantly against the RAF's Spitfires and Hurricanes, which were forced to engage in turning combat to protect their bombers. It had worked against Soviet fighters on the Eastern Front, where German pilots racked up astronomical victory scores. There was no reason it shouldn't work against the Americans, except it wasn't working, and Galland was beginning to understand why. The P-47 pilots had developed a completely different tactical philosophy, one that rendered German maneuverability advantages irrelevant. By maintaining altitude and refusing to turn, the Americans controlled the engagement. They could choose when to attack and when to disengage, and their 8-gun armament meant they didn't need prolonged firing opportunities. A 2-second burst was sufficient to destroy any German fighter. Galland called a meeting of his most experienced squadron commanders to discuss the problem. The meeting, held in a commandeered chateau outside Paris, brought together some of the Luftwaffe's most successful aces. Hauptmann Josef Pips Priller, commander of JG-26, Major Egon Meyer, who had pioneered head-on attacks against American bombers, and Oberleutnant Walter Gülle-Oesau, a 100-victory ace from the Eastern Front. The Americans have created a fighter that negates our tactical advantages, Galland began. The P-47 cannot turn with our aircraft, but it doesn't need to. Its pilots use altitude and speed to control the engagement. They attack from above, fire a devastating burst, and escape before we can respond. Our pilots report that when hit by the P-47's 8 machine guns, aircraft are frequently destroyed completely, wings separating, immediate fires, catastrophic structural failure. Then we must force them to fight on our terms, Priller argued. If they won't turn, we must position ourselves so they have no choice. How? Galland asked. They have altitude advantage. They have speed advantage in the dive, and their escort tactics are disciplined. They maintain formation and don't chase individual targets. Every time our pilots try to force an engagement, the P-47s simply dive away, extend, and climb back to altitude. The room fell silent. These were men who had collectively shot down over 500 Allied aircraft. They had faced Spitfires, Hurricanes, P-40s, and every Soviet fighter type. But the P-47, flown according to American tactical doctrine, presented a problem they couldn't solve with existing methods. The intelligence gap. Part of the Luftwaffe's confusion stemmed from incomplete intelligence about the P-47's capabilities. German technical intelligence had obtained detailed information about the aircraft's weight, engine power, and armament from crashed examples, but they had significantly underestimated the effectiveness of the 8-gun armament. Luftwaffe intelligence reports from July 1943 noted that the P-47 carried 8 12.7mm machine guns, with approximately 400 rounds per gun. The reports correctly identified the weapons as Browning M2s, but the analysis concluded that this armament, while heavy, was not significantly more effective than the 6-gun armament of other American fighters. This assessment was catastrophically wrong. The difference between 6 and 8 guns wasn't merely quantitative, it was qualitative. 6 guns, firing for 3 seconds, delivered approximately 300 rounds on target. 8 guns delivered 400 rounds. But more critically, the 8-gun pattern created a denser cone of fire that was more likely to achieve hits on critical components. The probability of striking the engine, cockpit, or fuel tanks increased exponentially with the additional guns. German pilots were discovering this reality in the most brutal way possible. Lieutenant Franz Stiegler, a Bf-109 pilot with JG-27, described an encounter with P-47s over the Ruhr Valley. I was attacking a bomber formation when the P-47s dove on us from above. I never saw the one that hit me. There was a sound like a giant tearing canvas, and my aircraft was suddenly full of holes. The instrument panel exploded. The canopy shattered. I felt impacts all along the fuselage. The entire engagement lasted perhaps 2 seconds. When I looked back, my wingman's aircraft was falling in pieces. The P-47 that had attacked us was already climbing away, completely out of range. We had no opportunity to return fire, no chance to maneuver. They simply destroyed us and left. The psychological impact. By August 1943, the psychological effect of the P-47's firepower was becoming as significant as its physical impact. German pilots, accustomed to dominating the skies over Europe, were experiencing something new: fear of a specific enemy aircraft. Luftwaffe combat reports from this period reveal a pattern of hesitation and defensive tactics that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Pilots reported breaking off attacks on bomber formations when P-47s were present, even when the Germans had numerical superiority. Squadron commanders noted declining morale and increasing reluctance to engage American escorts. Oberleutnant Heinz Knoke, a veteran pilot with JG-11, wrote in his diary, "The American Thunderbolt is a terrible opponent. It appears from nowhere, moving at impossible speeds. The sound of its 8 machine guns is distinctive, a deep, rapid hammering that means death. When you hear that sound, you know someone is about to die. Usually it's one of us. The aircraft is so heavy that our cannon shells seem to have little effect. I have seen Thunderbolts absorb hits that would destroy a Bf-109 and continue fighting. But when they hit you, there is no surviving. The aircraft comes apart." This psychological dimension was something Galland recognized as potentially more dangerous than the tactical challenges. An air force that feared its opponent had already lost half the battle. He needed to develop new tactics quickly before the fear became paralyzing. The failed counter-tactics. Throughout late summer 1943, Luftwaffe units experimented with various tactics to counter the P-47 threat. Each approach failed for different reasons, revealing just how thoroughly the American fighter had disrupted German tactical doctrine. Tactic 1. High-altitude interception. German fighters attempted to match the P-47's altitude advantage by climbing to 30,000 feet before engaging. This failed because the P-47's turbocharged engine performed better at extreme altitude than the Bf-109's or FW-190's supercharged engines. The Americans could simply climb higher, maintaining their advantage. Tactic 2. Head-on attacks. Some units tried head-on passes against P-47 formations, hoping to force the Americans into turning combat. This proved suicidal. The P-47's 8 guns, firing head-on, created a cone of fire that was nearly impossible to fly through. Several German pilots were killed attempting this tactic before it was abandoned. Tactic 3. Diving attacks from above. A few units tried to gain altitude advantage over the P-47s and attack from above, using the Americans' own tactics against them. This occasionally worked, but required perfect positioning and timing. More often, the P-47s detected the threat and either climbed away or turned the tables, using their superior dive speed to escape and counterattack. Tactic 4. Numerical superiority. The most common approach was simply to overwhelm P-47 formations with numbers, accepting heavy losses in exchange for breaking through to the bombers. This was effective in the short term. German fighters could usually destroy several bombers before the P-47s drove them off, but the loss rates were unsustainable. In August 1943, some Luftwaffe fighter groups lost over 30% of their pilots in a single month. September 6, 1943, Stuttgart. The mission to Stuttgart on September 6, 1943, crystallized the Luftwaffe's dilemma. Over 300 German fighters rose to intercept the American bomber stream, the largest defensive effort yet mounted. The Luftwaffe had carefully positioned its forces to attack the bombers during the brief period when they would be beyond P-47 escort range. But Republic Aviation had been working on a solution to the range problem. The P-47s that escorted the bombers that day carried newly developed 108-gallon external fuel tanks, extending their range by over 200 miles. When the German fighters attacked, expecting to find the bombers unescorted, they instead encountered over 100 P-47s at 28,000 feet. The battle that followed was the largest air combat yet fought over Germany. The P-47s, using their now perfected boom and zoom tactics, dove repeatedly through the German formations. The 8-gun armament proved devastating in the swirling combat. German fighters that tried to turn and fight found themselves unable to escape the diving P-47s. Those that tried to dive away discovered that the P-47 could match their speed and even accelerate in the dive. The Luftwaffe lost 45 fighters that day, nearly 15% of the force committed. The Americans lost 12 P-47s, most to ground fire or mechanical failures rather than air combat. The kill ratio of nearly 4.1 in favor of the Americans was unprecedented in the air war over Europe. The realization. In the weeks following Stuttgart, Galland came to a sobering conclusion. The Luftwaffe could not defeat the P-47 using existing tactics and aircraft. The American fighter had fundamentally changed the nature of air combat over Europe. Its combination of high-altitude performance, dive speed, structural strength, and overwhelming firepower created a weapon system that German fighters couldn't counter effectively. In a report to Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, Galland wrote, "The American P-47, when flown according to proper tactics, is nearly invulnerable to our current fighter types. Its 8 heavy machine guns can destroy our aircraft in a single pass. Its structural strength allows it to absorb damage that would destroy our fighters. Its high-altitude performance exceeds our capabilities. Most critically, its pilots have developed tactical doctrine that negates our advantages in maneuverability. Unless we develop new aircraft and tactics specifically designed to counter this threat, we will lose air superiority over the Reich." Göring, characteristically, refused to accept this assessment. He blamed pilot quality, leadership, and fighting spirit, anything except the possibility that German aircraft and tactics were inadequate. But the pilots in the cockpits knew the truth. The P-47 Thunderbolt, armed with 8 Browning M2 machine guns and flown by increasingly skilled American pilots, had become the dominant fighter over Europe, and the Luftwaffe had no answer. 8th Air Force Headquarters, High Wycombe, England, October 14, 1943. The operations room fell silent as the final loss reports came in from the Schweinfurt mission. Of the 291 B-17s that had attacked the ball-bearing factories deep in Germany, 60 had been shot down. Another 17 were so badly damaged they would never fly again. Nearly 600 American airmen were dead, missing or captured. The losses represented more than 20% of the attacking force, a catastrophic rate that, if sustained, would destroy the 8th Air Force's bomber fleet in less than 2 months. Major General Frederick Anderson, Deputy Commander for Operations, stared at the mission map with the grim realization that the entire strategic bombing campaign hung in the balance. The problem was brutally simple. The P-47s, despite their effectiveness in combat, couldn't escort the bombers all the way to targets deep in Germany. The Thunderbolts had to turn back somewhere over the German border, leaving the bombers to face hundreds of Luftwaffe fighters alone for the final 200 miles to the target and back. "We need more range," Anderson said quietly. "Without it, we're sending these men to their deaths." The P-47's range limitation wasn't a design flaw, it was a consequence of physics. The massive R-2800 engine consumed fuel at a prodigious rate. The aircraft's internal fuel capacity of 305 gallons provided approximately 2 hours of flight time at combat power, which translated to a combat radius of about 175 miles. External fuel tanks had extended this to roughly 230 miles, but that still left a gap of over 200 miles where the bombers flew unescorted. Republic Aviation had been working on the problem since summer, but the solution required innovations that pushed 1940s technology to its limits. The crisis of Schweinfurt, which would be remembered as Black Thursday, transformed that work from an engineering project into a desperate race against time. The drop tank revolution, the concept of external fuel tanks, wasn't new. The P-47 had been flying with 75-gallon belly tanks since June 1943, but these early tanks were problematic. They were made of pressed paper impregnated with resin, a material chosen because aluminum was in short supply. The paper tanks leaked. They sometimes failed to feed fuel properly, and they occasionally broke apart in flight, particularly during high-speed maneuvers. More critically, the 75-gallon tanks didn't provide enough additional range. Even with the tank, P-47s could barely reach the German border before having to turn back. What the 8th Air Force needed was a tank that could carry 150 gallons or more, enough to extend the P-47's combat radius to 400 miles, deep into Germany. The engineering challenges were formidable. A 150-gallon fuel tank, when full, weighed over 900 pounds. Mounting this weight under the P-47's fuselage created severe aerodynamic and structural problems. The tank had to be streamlined enough not to destroy the aircraft's performance. It had to feed fuel reliably at altitudes up to 30,000 feet, where air pressure was less than a third of sea level. It had to be strong enough to withstand the aerodynamic forces of 400-mile-per-hour flight. And it had to be cheap and quick to manufacture. The 8th Air Force needed thousands of them immediately. Republic Aviation's solution was elegant in its simplicity, but revolutionary in its execution. They designed a teardrop-shaped metal tank that mounted on a single centerline pylon under the fuselage. The tank was pressurized using bleed air from the engine, ensuring reliable fuel flow at high altitude. Most ingeniously, the tank was designed to be jettisoned when empty, or when the pilot needed maximum performance for combat. The mounting pylon included an explosive release mechanism that could drop the tank in less than a second. The first 108-gallon metal drop tanks arrived in England in August 1943. By October, production had ramped up to over 500 tanks per week. But the Schweinfurt disaster made it clear that even 108 gallons wasn't enough. The 8th Air Force needed more range, and they needed it immediately. The 150-gallon crisis. In late October 1943, Republic Aviation began crash development of a 150-gallon drop tank. The project faced a crisis that threatened to derail the entire program. The tanks kept failing in flight. The problem was discovered during test flights at Republic's Farmingdale facility. At speeds above 350 miles per hour, the 150-gallon tanks began to vibrate violently. In several test flights, the tanks broke apart, forcing pilots to make emergency landings. The cause was aerodynamic flutter. The tank's shape created turbulent airflow that induced destructive vibrations. Alexander Kartveli, Republic's chief designer, assembled a team of engineers to solve the problem. They had less than 3 weeks. The 8th Air Force had scheduled a maximum effort mission deep into Germany for mid-November, and without the 150-gallon tanks, the mission would face the same catastrophic losses as Schweinfurt. The solution came from an unexpected source. A young aerodynamicist named Robert Widmer suggested adding small fins to the rear of the tank to stabilize the airflow. The fins, each about 6 inches long, disrupted the turbulent vortices that caused the flutter. Wind tunnel tests confirmed the theory. By November 1st, the modified tanks were in production. But manufacturing 150-gallon tanks in the quantities needed presented another crisis. The tanks required specialized welding techniques to ensure they wouldn't leak under pressure. The explosive release mechanisms had to be precisely calibrated. Too weak, and the tank wouldn't release. Too strong, and it might detach prematurely. Quality control was critical, but production speed was equally essential. Republic Aviation converted an entire factory building to drop tank production, running 3 shifts around the clock. By mid-November, they were producing over 200 tanks per day. The tanks were shipped to England by fast convoy, arriving just days before the planned mission. The armament crisis. While engineers struggled with range problems, another crisis was developing with the P-47's armament. The 8 M2 Brownings, while devastatingly effective when they worked, were experiencing increasing reliability problems as operations intensified. The root cause was wear. Each M2 barrel was rated for approximately 10,000 rounds before accuracy degraded significantly. But in the intense combat of fall 1943, some P-47s were firing their entire ammunition load, 3,400 rounds, on every mission. This meant that barrels needed replacement after just 3 combat missions. The 8th Air Force didn't have enough spare barrels to maintain this replacement rate. Worse, the guns themselves were wearing out. The M2's bolt and barrel extension, subjected to the enormous pressures of firing thousands of rounds at high altitude, developed cracks and stress fractures. Guns that had fired more than 50,000 rounds, about 15 combat missions, began experiencing catastrophic failures, with bolts breaking or barrels separating from the receiver. The 8th Air Force's armament officers faced a terrible choice: reduce the number of guns per aircraft to extend barrel life, or accept increasing gun failures in combat. Neither option was acceptable. The solution came from Colt's Patent Firearms Manufacturing Company, which produced the M2 under license from Browning. Colt's engineers developed a chrome-plated barrel that significantly extended service life, from 10,000 rounds to over 15,000. They also redesigned the bolt using a stronger steel alloy that could withstand higher pressures without cracking. But implementing these improvements required replacing components in thousands of guns already in service. The 8th Air Force established specialized armament depots where P-47s were rotated through for gun upgrades. Each aircraft spent 48 hours in the depot while armament crews removed all 8 guns, replaced worn components, and test-fired the weapons before reinstalling them. The process was labor-intensive and time-consuming, but it was essential. By December 1943, over 80% of the 8th Air Force's P-47s had been upgraded with the improved guns. The failure rate dropped from nearly 15% to less than 3%, a critical improvement that meant pilots could rely on their weapons in combat. The ammunition innovation. The final crisis of fall 1943 involved ammunition. The standard M2 ammunition belt, mixed armor-piercing incendiary, API, ball, tracer, and armor-piercing incendiary tracer, APIT, rounds in a 4.1.1.1 ratio. This mixture had proven effective against German fighters, but pilots reported that it was less effective against the new, heavily armored German bombers that were beginning to appear. Aircraft like the Ju-88 and He-111, which featured armor plating around the engines and cockpit. The Ordnance Department developed a new ammunition type specifically for the P-47, the M8 armor-piercing incendiary round. The M8 featured a hardened steel core that could penetrate up to 2 inches of armor at 200 yards, significantly more than the standard API round. The incendiary component was also improved, using a more reliable ignition system that was less affected by extreme cold. But the M8 rounds were heavier than standard ammunition, which meant that each gun could carry fewer rounds, approximately 375 per gun instead of 425. This reduced the P-47's total firing time from 30 seconds to about 27 seconds. Pilots and commanders debated whether the increased penetration was worth the reduced ammunition capacity. The debate was settled by combat results. P-47s loaded with M8 ammunition proved significantly more effective against German bombers and heavily armored fighters like the FW-190A6. The increased penetration meant that pilots could engage from longer ranges with confidence that their rounds would penetrate critical components. By January 1944, M8 ammunition had become standard for all P-47 units. November 26, 1943. Bremen. The mission to Bremen on November 26, 1943, was the first test of the complete package of innovations developed in response to the Schweinfurt crisis. The P-47s carried the new 150-gallon drop tanks, giving them a combat radius of over 400 miles. Their guns had been upgraded with chrome-plated barrels and strengthened bolts. Their ammunition belts were loaded with the new M8 armor-piercing rounds. The results exceeded all expectations. The P-47s escorted the bombers all the way to Bremen and back, the first time American fighters had provided continuous escort on a deep penetration mission. When Luftwaffe fighters attacked, the P-47s were there at altitude, ready to dive on them with their 8-gun armament. The combat was intense. Over 200 German fighters rose to intercept the bomber stream, but the continuous P-47 escort prevented them from making coordinated attacks. Individual German fighters that pressed their attacks were destroyed by diving P-47s. The 8 M2 Brownings, firing the new M8 ammunition, proved devastatingly effective. Pilots reported that German fighters hit by the improved rounds often exploded or broke apart immediately. The 8th Air Force lost 25 bombers that day, a significant loss, but less than half the rate of Schweinfurt. The P-47s claimed 41 German fighters, destroyed for the loss of 11 Thunderbolts. More importantly, the mission proved that deep penetration raids with continuous fighter escort were possible. The strategic bombing campaign could continue. The human cost of innovation. The innovations that saved the strategic bombing campaign came at a price that is rarely discussed in histories of the air war. The crash programs to develop drop tanks, improve guns, and manufacture new ammunition required extraordinary efforts from thousands of workers in factories across America and England. At Republic Aviation's Farmingdale plant, workers logged over 100,000 hours of overtime in November 1943 alone. The drop tank production line operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Workers developed chronic health problems from exposure to fuel vapors and industrial chemicals. Several died in industrial accidents as safety protocols were relaxed to meet production deadlines. In England, armament crews worked through the brutal winter of 1943-44, often in unheated hangars, removing and replacing guns on P-47s. Frostbite was common. The work was dangerous. Mishandling the explosive release mechanisms on drop tanks resulted in several serious injuries. But these workers understood what was at stake. Every drop tank they produced, every gun they repaired, every ammunition belt they loaded meant that American bomber crews had a better chance of survival. The innovation under pressure that characterized the P-47 program in late 1943 was as much a triumph of industrial determination as it was of engineering brilliance. By December 1943, the P-47 Thunderbolt had evolved from a promising but limited fighter into the dominant air superiority weapon over Europe. The combination of extended range, reliable armament, and improved ammunition transformed it into a weapon system that the Luftwaffe could not counter. The crisis that had threatened to end the strategic bombing campaign had instead forged the weapon that would win the air war. Jagdgeschwader, 26 Operations Room, Lille-Nord Airfield, France, January 3, 1944. Major Joseph Pips Priller, one of the Luftwaffe's most decorated fighter pilots with over 100 victories, stood before the mission board with a sense of foreboding he'd never experienced in 4 years of combat. The morning's intelligence briefing had reported an American bomber formation of over 600 B-17s and B-24s heading toward targets in western Germany. More ominously, the report estimated that over 500 P-47 Thunderbolts would escort them, the largest fighter escort yet assembled. Priller's JG-26, once the elite of the Luftwaffe's fighter force, could muster only 32 serviceable aircraft that morning. Of his pilots, fewer than half had more than 50 hours of combat experience. The rest were replacements. Some with as little as 20 hours in the FW-190, they would be facing American pilots who had been flying combat missions for 6 months or more in aircraft that now outranged and outgunned anything the Luftwaffe could field. "We will attack the bombers from head-on," Priller briefed his pilots. "Ignore the escorts if possible. Our only chance is to break up the bomber formations before they reach the target. If the Thunderbolts engage you, do not attempt to turn with them. Dive away at full power and escape at low altitude. Is that understood?" The young pilots nodded, but Priller could see the fear in their eyes. They had all heard the stories about the P-47's 8 machine guns, about aircraft that disintegrated under the American fighters' fire, about pilots who never had a chance to bail out. The Thunderbolt had acquired an almost mythical status among Luftwaffe pilots, a reputation that was destroying morale as effectively as the aircraft itself was destroying fighters. The tactical transformation. By January 1944, the air war over Europe had fundamentally changed. The P-47, equipped with 150-gallon drop tanks and flying in formations of 200 or more aircraft, had established air superiority over most of Germany. The Luftwaffe's fighter force, which had numbered over 1,000 aircraft in summer 1943, had been reduced to fewer than 600 serviceable fighters through combat losses and the inability to replace aircraft as quickly as they were destroyed. But the numbers told only part of the story. The real transformation was tactical. The P-47 units had perfected a system of layered escort that made it nearly impossible for German fighters to attack the bombers effectively. The escort system worked like this. One group of P-47s flew high cover at 32,000 feet, positioned to dive on any German fighters attempting to climb to attack altitude. A second group flew close escort at the bomber's altitude, ready to break up any attacks that developed. A third group flew as freelance fighters, roaming ahead of the bomber stream to intercept German fighters before they could form up for coordinated attacks. This system exploited every advantage the P-47 possessed. The high cover group used altitude and the aircraft's superior dive speed to destroy German fighters before they could threaten the bombers. The close escort group used the P-47's heavy firepower to break up attacks in progress. The freelance fighters used the aircraft's range to push the battle away from the bombers, forcing the Luftwaffe to fight on American terms. German fighter controllers, monitoring the American formations on radar, found themselves unable to develop effective counter-tactics. If they directed their fighters to climb above the bomber stream, the high-cover P-47s dove on them. If they attacked at bomber altitude, the close escort engaged them. If they tried to form up ahead of the bombers, the freelance fighters intercepted them. The result was a steady attrition of the Luftwaffe's fighter force that Germany's aircraft industry couldn't replace. In January 1944 alone, the Luftwaffe lost over 1,000 fighters, more than 30% of its entire force. The P-47s accounted for approximately 400 of these losses, with the remainder falling to other American fighters, anti-aircraft fire, and operational accidents. The killing ground. The mission of January 11, 1944, a strike against aircraft factories in central Germany, demonstrated the complete dominance the P-47 had achieved. Over 650 bombers attacked the targets, escorted by 475 P-47s from 7 different fighter groups. The Luftwaffe committed nearly 400 fighters to the defense, one of the largest defensive efforts of the war. The battle that developed was less a combat than a massacre. The P-47s, operating in their layered escort system, systematically destroyed German formations before they could coordinate their attacks. The 8-gun armament proved devastating in the swirling combat. Pilots reported that German fighters, when hit, often exploded or broke apart immediately. The improved M8 armor-piercing ammunition was penetrating fuel tanks and ammunition stores with catastrophic results. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabreski, leading the 56th Fighter Group's high cover element, described the engagement. "We had altitude advantage and we used it. Every time a German formation tried to climb to attack the bombers, we dove through them. The 850s were absolutely devastating. I saw one FW-190 literally disintegrate when my wingman hit it. The wing separated, the fuselage broke in half, and the pilot never got out. It wasn't combat in the traditional sense. It was more like shooting practice. The Germans couldn't maneuver, couldn't escape, couldn't fight back effectively. They were just targets. The statistics from that mission told the story. The Luftwaffe lost 152 fighters, nearly 40% of the force committed. The Americans lost 60 bombers and 5 P-47s. The kill ratio of 30.1 in fighter versus fighter combat was unprecedented in the air war over Europe. The voice of defeat. German combat reports and pilot accounts from early 1944 reveal a force in psychological collapse. The confidence and aggressive spirit that had characterized the Luftwaffe in earlier years had been replaced by fatalism and despair. Lieutenant Heinz Knoke, whose diary provides one of the most detailed accounts of the Luftwaffe's experience, wrote on January 15, 1944, "We are being systematically destroyed. The American Thunderbolts are everywhere, always above us, always faster, always with more ammunition. When they attack, there is no defense. The sound of their 8 machine guns has become the sound of death. I have seen 20 of my comrades killed in the past month. Most never had a chance to bail out. The Thunderbolts' fire is so concentrated, so devastating, that aircraft simply come apart. We are no longer fighting to win. We are fighting to survive each mission. The war in the air is lost." This sentiment was echoed in official Luftwaffe reports. A tactical assessment from Luftflotte 3, responsible for air defense of Western Germany, concluded, "The American P-47, when employed in large formations with proper tactical doctrine, has achieved air superiority that we cannot contest. The aircraft's combination of high-altitude performance, heavy armament, and extended range has created a weapon system against which our current fighter types are inadequate. Pilot morale is declining rapidly. Replacement pilots are being killed on their first or second missions before they can gain the experience necessary to survive. Unless new aircraft types with superior performance are introduced immediately, the fighter force will be unable to defend the Reich." The desperation tactics. As conventional tactics failed, some Luftwaffe units resorted to increasingly desperate measures. The most extreme was the Sturmgruppe concept, heavily armored FW-190s that would press attacks on bombers to point-blank range, accepting heavy losses in exchange for guaranteed kills. The Sturmgruppen aircraft were modified with additional armor plating around the cockpit and engine, bringing their weight to over 10,000 pounds. They carried heavy 30mm cannons that could destroy a bomber with a single hit. The pilots were volunteers, often veterans who had survived dozens of missions and were willing to accept near-suicidal odds for a chance to stop the bombers. The first Sturmgruppe mission, flown on March 6, 1944, achieved initial success. A formation of 40 heavily armored FW-190s broke through the P-47 escort and destroyed 17 bombers in a single attack. But the cost was catastrophic. 23 of the 40 Sturmgruppe aircraft were shot down, most by P-47s that dove on them as they reformed after their attack. The problem was fundamental. The Sturmgruppe aircraft, weighted down with armor and heavy cannons, were even less maneuverable than standard FW-190s. They couldn't escape diving P-47s, and the P-47's 850 caliber guns, firing M8 armor-piercing ammunition, could penetrate even the Sturmgruppe's heavy armor at close range. After 3 missions, the Sturmgruppe concept was abandoned. The loss rate, over 50% per mission, was unsustainable. The Luftwaffe simply didn't have enough experienced pilots to continue throwing them away in near-suicidal attacks. The industrial collapse, the P-47's dominance had consequences that extended far beyond individual air battles. By establishing air superiority over Germany, the Thunderbolts enabled the strategic bombing campaign to continue with increasing effectiveness. German aircraft factories, ball-bearing plants and oil refineries were systematically destroyed, crippling the Luftwaffe's ability to replace its losses. The statistics were devastating. In January 1944, German aircraft production stood at approximately 1,000 fighters per month. By April, after 3 months of intensive bombing protected by P-47 escorts, production had fallen to fewer than 600 fighters per month. The Luftwaffe was losing over 1,000 fighters per month in combat. The mathematics of attrition were inexorable. The fighter force was being destroyed faster than it could be replaced. Oil production suffered even more severely. The P-47 escorts enabled American bombers to attack synthetic oil plants deep in Germany with relative impunity. By June 1944, German aviation fuel production had fallen by over 50%. Luftwaffe units were forced to reduce training hours for new pilots, creating a vicious cycle where inadequately trained pilots died quickly in combat, requiring more replacements who received even less training. March 6, 1944. Berlin. The first American bombing raid on Berlin, the capital of the Reich, marked the symbolic end of the Luftwaffe's ability to defend German airspace. Over 700 bombers attacked the city, escorted by over 800 fighters, including 400 P-47s. The Luftwaffe committed every available fighter to the defense. Over 500 aircraft, including units pulled from other fronts. The battle over Berlin lasted nearly 3 hours and ranged across 200 miles of German airspace. The P-47s, operating in their layered escort system, systematically destroyed German formations as they tried to attack the bombers. The 8-gun armament proved decisive in the massive combat. Pilots reported firing all their ammunition, 3,400 rounds, in multiple engagements, destroying 2 or 3 German fighters per sortie. The Luftwaffe lost 179 fighters that day, the highest single-day loss of the war. The Americans lost 69 bombers and 11 fighters. More significantly, the psychological impact was devastating. Berlin, the heart of the Reich, had been bombed in daylight while the Luftwaffe watched helplessly. The myth of German air superiority was shattered completely. General Major Adolf Galland, in a report to Hermann Göring after the Berlin raid, wrote, "The American fighter escort, particularly the P-47 Thunderbolt, has achieved complete air superiority over the Reich. Our fighter force is being systematically destroyed. We are losing our most experienced pilots at a rate that cannot be sustained. The new pilots we receive have inadequate training and are killed on their first missions." The P-47's 8-gun armament is proving more effective than we anticipated. Aircraft hit by concentrated fire from all 8 guns are frequently destroyed completely, giving pilots no chance to bail out. Unless we receive new aircraft with superior performance and adequate numbers of trained pilots, we will be unable to defend German airspace within 3 months. Göring's response was to blame the pilots for lack of fighting spirit, but the pilots knew the truth. The P-47 Thunderbolt, armed with 8 Browning M2 machine guns and flown by increasingly skilled American pilots, had won the air war over Europe. The Luftwaffe's collapse was no longer a question of if, but when. By spring 1944, the P-47 had achieved what no other fighter had accomplished. It had broken the Luftwaffe's will to fight. The psychological impact of the 8-gun armament, combined with the aircraft's tactical advantages and the Americans' superior numbers, had created a situation where German pilots increasingly refused to engage. The sound of 850 caliber machine guns firing in unison had become the sound of inevitable defeat. Tempelhof Airfield, Berlin, May 8, 1945. The massive P-47 Thunderbolt sat on the tarmac of what had been the Luftwaffe's most prestigious airfield, its 8 gun ports still bearing the scorch marks of recent combat. Around it, the wreckage of German aircraft lay scattered across the field. Bf-109s, FW-190s, and Me-262 jets, all destroyed in the final days of the war. Captain Francis Gabreski, now a 28 victory ace and one of the most successful P-47 pilots of the war, walked around the aircraft that had carried him through 166 combat missions. "This airplane saved my life more times than I can count," Gabreski told a reporter from Stars and Stripes. "But more than that, it won the air war. When we started flying these in 1943, the Luftwaffe owned the sky over Germany. 2 years later, they couldn't put up a dozen fighters to defend their own capital. The P-47 did that. Those 850s did that. The war in Europe was over. The Luftwaffe had been destroyed as an effective fighting force, and the P-47 Thunderbolt, armed with John Browning's M2 machine guns, had been the primary instrument of that destruction. But the aircraft's legacy would extend far beyond the battlefields of World War II, fundamentally changing how air forces around the world thought about fighter armament, tactics, and design. The final accounting. The statistics of the P-47's combat record tell a story of unprecedented effectiveness. Between April 1943 and May 1945, P-47 Thunderbolts flew over 546,000 combat sorties in the European theatre, more than any other American fighter type. They were credited with destroying 3,752 German aircraft in air-to-air combat, plus an additional 3,315 aircraft destroyed on the ground during strafing attacks. But these numbers, impressive as they are, don't capture the full impact of the P-47's 8-gun armament. The kill-to-loss ratio tells a more complete story. P-47s achieved a 4.6.1 kill ratio in air-to-air combat. For every P-47 lost to enemy fighters, American pilots destroyed 4.6 German aircraft. This ratio was significantly higher than other American fighters of the period and unprecedented in the history of air combat. More significantly, the P-47's effectiveness improved dramatically over time as pilots mastered the aircraft's capabilities and tactics. In the first 6 months of operations, April-September 1943, the kill ratio was approximately 2:1. By the final 6 months of the war, November 1944, May 1945, it had increased to over 7.1. This improvement reflected both the declining quality of Luftwaffe pilots and the increasing skill of American pilots. But it also demonstrated the P-47's fundamental superiority when flown according to proper tactical doctrine. The 8-gun armament was central to this success. Analysis of combat camera footage and pilot reports revealed that the P-47's firepower was achieving effects that 6-gun fighters couldn't match. The average firing time required to destroy an enemy aircraft was 2.3 seconds for P-47s, compared to 3.8 seconds for 6-gun fighters like the P-51 Mustang. This difference was critical in combat, where firing opportunities often lasted only a few seconds. The Browning legacy, John Moses. Browning had died in 1926, 17 years before the first P-47 entered combat. He never saw his M2 machine gun mounted in an aircraft, never witnessed the devastating effectiveness of 8 of his weapons firing simultaneously. But his design proved so fundamentally sound that it dominated aerial warfare for the entire war and beyond. The M2's reliability in combat was extraordinary. Despite operating in conditions Browning could never have anticipated, temperatures ranging from -60 degrees Fahrenheit at high altitude to over 120 degrees in the gun bay during sustained firing, G-forces exceeding 8 Gs during violent maneuvers, and exposure to rain, ice, and dust, the M2 maintained a reliability rate exceeding 97%. Gun jams, which had plagued earlier aircraft weapons, were rare enough that pilots could depend on their armament in combat. The weapon's versatility was equally impressive. The same basic M2 design served in roles ranging from air-to-air combat to ground attack, anti-aircraft defense, and even anti-tank warfare. The ability to fire different ammunition types, armor-piercing, incendiary, tracer, and explosive from the same weapon gave commanders tactical flexibility that no other weapon system could match. But perhaps the M2's most significant legacy was its longevity. The weapon remained in frontline service with the U.S. military for over 90 years after its introduction, serving in every American conflict from World War I through the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Modern versions of the M2, with improved materials and manufacturing techniques, are still in production today. No other weapon in history has maintained frontline service for so long, a testament to the fundamental soundness of Browning's design. The tactical revolution, the P-47's combat experience, fundamentally changed fighter tactics and doctrine. The boom and zoom tactics developed by P-47 pilots, using altitude advantage and dive speed to attack, then extending away before the enemy could respond, became the foundation of jet fighter tactics in the post-war era. The U.S. Air Force's Fighter Weapons School, established in 1949, incorporated P-47 combat lessons into its curriculum. The emphasis on energy management, altitude advantage, and decisive firepower that characterized P-47 tactics became core principles of fighter combat that remain relevant today. Modern fighter pilots still study the tactical innovations developed by P-47 aces like Hub Zemke, Francis Gabreski, and Robert Johnson. The layered escort system pioneered by P-47 units became the standard model for fighter escort operations. The concept of high cover, close escort, and freelance fighters was employed in Korea, Vietnam, and every subsequent conflict involving bomber escort. The fundamental principle, using different fighter elements at different altitudes to create a defensive system that's difficult to penetrate, remains central to modern air combat doctrine. The design influence. The P-47's success influenced fighter design for decades after the war. The principle that heavy armament and structural strength could compensate for reduced maneuverability became a cornerstone of American fighter design philosophy. Aircraft like the F-84 Thunderjet, F-105 Thunderchief, and F-4 Phantom all reflected lessons learned from the P-47 experience. The 8-gun armament became the standard for American fighters in the immediate post-war period. The F-80 Shooting Star, America's first operational jet fighter, carried 6 50-caliber machine guns, a reduction from the P-47's 8, but still heavy by international standards. The F-86 Sabre, which dominated the skies over Korea, also carried 6 50 calibers. It wasn't until the introduction of 20mm cannons in the 1950s that American fighters moved away from the 50-caliber armament that had proven so effective in World War II. The P-47's structural strength, its ability to absorb tremendous damage and continue fighting, also influenced post-war design. The concept of building fighters that could survive hits and bring their pilots home became a priority for American aircraft designers. This philosophy reached its apex with the A-10 Thunderbolt II, a ground attack aircraft specifically designed to survive heavy damage while delivering devastating firepower, a direct descendant of the P-47's design philosophy. The human stories behind the statistics and tactical innovations were the men who flew the P-47 in combat. Their experiences and memories provide the most compelling testament to the aircraft's effectiveness and the impact of its 8-gun armament. Colonel Hub Zemke, who commanded the 56th Fighter Group to become the highest-scoring P-47 unit of the war with 674 aerial victories, reflected on his experience in a 1989 interview. The P-47 was a pilot's airplane. It was big, it was heavy, it was tough. But when you learned to fly it properly, it was unbeatable. Those 850s gave you confidence. You knew that if you got a good shot, the target was going down. I saw German fighters literally explode when hit by all 8 guns. The psychological effect was enormous. German pilots would break off attacks when they saw P-47s diving on them. Even if they had numerical superiority, they knew what those 8 guns could do. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabreski, the top P-47 ace in Europe, described the weapon's effectiveness. The 8-gun armament was the P-47's greatest advantage. In combat, you often had only 2 or 3 seconds to fire before your target escaped or you had to break off the attack. In those few seconds, the P-47 put more rounds on target than any other fighter. I destroyed 28 German aircraft in the P-47, and most of them went down after a single burst. The concentration of fire was just overwhelming. When all 8 guns hit, the target didn't just get damaged, it got destroyed. Captain Robert Johnson, who survived being hit by over 200 cannon and machine gun rounds during a single mission, spoke about the aircraft's durability. "The P-47 saved my life. No other fighter could have taken that kind of damage and kept flying. But it wasn't just the structure, it was the whole package. The 8 guns gave you offensive power. The structure gave you defensive power. The engine gave you speed to escape. It was a complete weapon system, not just an airplane." The final missions. The P-47's combat career didn't end with Germany's surrender. In the Pacific Theater, P-47 served with distinction in the Philippines, Okinawa, and the final campaigns against Japan. The 8-gun armament proved equally effective against Japanese aircraft, which were generally more lightly built than German fighters and even more vulnerable to the concentrated firepower. In the ground attack role, the P-47's 850 caliber guns were devastating against vehicles, trains, and ground installations. The armor-piercing ammunition could penetrate the armor of tanks and destroy locomotives. In the final months of the war, P-47s in Europe destroyed over 86,000 railway cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored vehicles, and 68,000 trucks, a testament to the versatility of Browning's weapon design. The last combat mission flown by a P-47 in World War II took place on August 14, 1945, the day Japan announced its surrender. A flight of P-47s from the 318th Fighter Group intercepted a formation of Japanese aircraft over Tokyo Bay, destroying 3 in the final air combat of the war. Appropriately, the P-47's 8 Browning machine guns fired the last shots in the air war that had begun nearly 6 years earlier. The post-war legacy. After the war, P-47s continued to serve with air forces around the world. The aircraft was supplied to over 30 countries through military aid programs, serving in conflicts from the Chinese Civil War to the 1965 India-Pakistan War. Some P-47s remained in active service until the late 1960s, over 20 years after the aircraft's first flight. The M2 Browning machine gun had an even longer service life. The weapon remained standard armament on American fighters through the Korean War and continued to serve in ground and vehicle-mounted roles for decades. Modern versions of the M2, with improved materials and manufacturing techniques, but fundamentally unchanged from Browning's original design, remain in service with the US military and over 100 other countries today. The final assessment. In the history of military aviation, few weapon systems have had the impact of the P-47 Thunderbolt armed with 8 Browning M2 machine guns. The combination of Alexander Kartvel's audacious design decision, John Browning's brilliant weapon design, and the tactical innovations of American pilots created a weapons system that fundamentally changed the nature of air combat. The P-47 didn't win the war alone. The contributions of other aircraft types, particularly the P-51 Mustang with its longer range, were equally important. But the Thunderbolt, with its 8-gun armament, broke the Luftwaffe's back. It established air superiority over Europe, enabling the strategic bombing campaign that crippled German industry. It protected bomber crews, saving thousands of lives. And it demonstrated that heavy firepower, properly employed, could overcome any tactical disadvantage. The decision made in a conference room at Republic Aviation in May 1940 to arm the P-47 with 8 guns instead of 6 changed the course of the air war and influenced fighter design for generations. John Browning's M2 machine gun, designed in 1921 for a completely different purpose, proved to be the perfect weapon for aerial combat. And the pilots who flew the P-47 into combat, learning to exploit its strengths while avoiding its weaknesses, created a tactical legacy that remains relevant today. On a spring morning in 1945, as Captain Francis Gabreski walked around his P-47 on the tarmac at Tempelhof, he understood what historians would later confirm. The massive fighter, with its 8 gun ports, had been the right weapon at the right time, flown by the right people. The sound of those 8 Browning machine guns firing in unison, the sound that had terrified Luftwaffe pilots and broken their will to fight, had been the sound of victory. The legacy of that sound echoes still in the design of modern fighters, in the tactics taught at fighter weapons schools, and in the continued service of Browning's remarkable weapon. The P-47 Thunderbolt and its 8-gun armament didn't just win battles, they changed how wars would be fought in the air for generations to come. The story of how John Browning's genius and Alexander Kartvel's bold decision transformed the P-47 into the Luftwaffe's nightmare is a testament to innovation, courage, and the decisive impact of superior firepower. These 8 machine guns didn't just destroy aircraft, they shattered an empire's air force and changed the course of history. If this story of engineering brilliance and aerial dominance captivated you, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the weapons, tactics, and untold stories that shaped World War II. Drop a comment below. What other hidden weapons of World War II should we explore? The Norden bomb sight, the proximity fuse, the Codebreakers war. Your suggestions drive our content. And if you found this story as powerful as those 8 Brownings firing in unison, smash that like button and share this video with anyone who appreciates the intersection of innovation and history. Together, we're keeping these incredible stories alive. Until next time, remember, sometimes the difference between victory and defeat comes down to a single decision made in a conference room and the courage to add just 2 more guns.